Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk about a marvelous recording of orchestral music by Morton Feldman. It's on the Capriccio label, which is wonderful because I can play you a sample. It consists of two major works, Coptic Light, which was his last completed instrumental, or pardon me, orchestral work. It was written around 1985. I believe he died in 1987. Yeah. And the piece called simply String Quartet and Orchestra. Now, Feldman was one of the great exponents of the musical avant-garde in the 60s and 70s. And the avant-garde was, well, what can you say? Very avant and very garde. The problem with the musical avant-garde was, let's put it this way, it really is a highfalutin way of saying that they were hyper-romantics. How were they hyper-romantics? Well, the whole concept of romanticism was the artist as, first of all, the artist as a higher being that was devoted to self-expression. Artists had to have their own personal style, which was a reflection of themselves, of their own feelings, their own impressions. That's who the Romantics were. And the avant-garde just sort of carried that to ridiculous extremes, because not only did they believe that music should be an expression of themselves, the music that they wrote should express their own feelings, but that the entire musical idiom had to be a completely unique expression or invention of their own. That is, it should be like nothing else in the history of humanity. It had to be a hermetically sealed personal little universe. Now, of course, some of the avant-gardes were more avant than others. I mean, some were brilliant creative geniuses, and they wrote fabulous music, and that music could be extremely expressive of human feelings or their own feelings. And there are some who were completely alienated from the idea that their music should express anything. It should be a total abstraction. And those were the most avant of the avant-garde people. In that crowd, you find, for example, Xenakis and the computer and stochastically generated music folks, and the musique concrète people, and all kinds of things like that. The abstract ones were more some of the minimalists originally. Of course, minimalism evolved to become less minimal, because the minimalists found that minimalism was very minimal, and they were tired of how minimal it was. And so they decided, well, gee, it would be nice if music meant something or expressed something. And so they gradually grew less minimal using the same techniques. And but the one of the most fascinating of the avant guys was Morton Feldman. And Morton Feldman is wonderful because his music is its own system. It truly is a unique creation that nobody else was doing. But at the same time, it is completely honest and legitimate for what it does. It's not. It doesn't have an attitude. In other words, because at their worst, the avant-garde composers were just a bunch of arrogant narcissists who believed that they deserved to be supported by whoever was foolish enough to fling money at them to do what they did. In Europe, that was the government. In America, it might be private people, but it's the same thing. But Feldman was fascinated in his later work, in his, what you might call his more mature work, and the works that really established his reputation. He was fascinated by the patterns of oriental rugs and fabrics, and how these things could be translated into music that was somehow representative of modern civilization, if you want to call it that. Obviously, there's not a lot of room in that kind of music for the expression of human feeling, or the traditional relationship between melody and vocal music. His music is rigorously atonal, but not, I want to say something about atonality. Atonality is only bad when the music sounds like it wants to be something else. In other words, you're much likelier to hear bad atonal music when the composer is trying to tell you that the atonal tunes are really tunes. because you really want them not to be atonal because they're tunes and you have certain expectations that the music isn't fulfilling. But when the music is self-consistent, as Feldman's is, then the atonality is simply part of the style. It's a necessary part of the style. His style has to be effectively atonal because what he wants you to pay attention to is the pattern. The patterns that he's creating and that shift and slowly change over time. And if there were a tune there, or traditional harmony, you would be anchored by that and have certain expectations because of that that would completely distract you from what the music is actually doing. This music is rigorously abstract. Now, normally when we say music is abstract, we're talking about things like Brahms symphonies, right? They're abstract because they're not about dogs or bushes or something, But no, they're not. They're the expression of feelings. And that's quite clear when we listen to them. Feldman's music is not. Feldman's music is the expression of these patterns, and patterns moving through time, because he's one of the few super duper avant-gardists who is really conscious of the time factor, the fact that music has to exist in a continuum and we have to sit and endure it. And so he's very careful to make it endurable if we choose to endure it. I mean, some of his pieces play for 4 to 6 hours, so it's an endurance test. But it isn't because he isn't conscious of the time factor. It's because he's exploiting it in his own specific way, and the music moves at its own particular pace. Now, these orchestral works are not terribly long. Coptic Light is 25 to 30 minutes. String Quartet and Orchestra is about the same. They're in a long single movement, and that single movement expresses basically what I just said. It's a pattern or a some sort of gesture which very, very slowly evolves over time. Now, his music is almost entirely static. It's very quiet. It's meant to be heard and listened to quietly. It doesn't attack you. It doesn't make you feel awful while you're listening to it. It's not boring, I don't think at all. It's meditative, and and somewhat timeless. And that, I think, is exactly what he was aiming for. Coptic Light, which is the first piece on the disc, is a very, very marvelous exploration of fog. You might call it fog. This was inspired by some patterns of fabric that he saw in the Louvre. How the music relates to that, I don't know. I didn't look at them in the Louvre. But the music itself is a sort of nebulous cloud out of which certain patterns emerge. Gradually, you begin to hear them as they repeat. They become clearer and clearer, and then they slowly shift and change. It's very beautiful. It's very warm music. It has an inner glow. Get it? Light. That's the light part. The Coptic part was the era in which those ancient fabrics were created. And String Quartet and Orchestra, well, of course, I'm waiting for someone to say that it obviously harkens back to the Baroque Concerto Grosso. Yeah, right. Oh, yeah. You do hear solo strings here and there, but there's really very little consciousness of a quartet operating as against the orchestra. It's all very well integrated. You just hear thinned out solo lines now and again, and it's similar to Coptic Light in what it does. It's a series of patterns that gradually shift over time, and there's not much else you need to say about it. You just experience it. You just listen to it. It's like watching a mobile or some sort of abstract shape, slowly rotating and with shifting shapes, and depending on your perspective as you walk around it or as if it moves. I mean, that's what this music is. It's an abstract creation. It's like a Jackson Pollock painting. I love this stuff. I really do. I think it's very self-consistency and honesty and directness of expression are indicative of the fact that Feldman really did invent a personal style, which is his and no one else's, but which is attractive and approachable if you're in the right frame of mind. But I always say, well, if you're in the right frame of mind, I mean, you don't listen to anything unless you're in the right frame of mind, right? And you don't listen to the Brandenburg concertos as opposed to a Mahler symphony unless you're in the right frame of mind. So Feldman has his frame of mind too. And I want to play you just a little bit of Coptic Light just to show you how it moves. And the way to do that is very simple. I'm going to play you about the opening 45 seconds and the closing 45 seconds. And from that, although what you will hear at the beginning you'll think is complete nebulous confusion, it isn't. These shapes are gradually defining themselves, and by the time you get to the end, they've changed considerably. Although the process is completely imperceptible, and you might not be conscious of it while it's happening. But when you get to the end, you realize you're not where you were at the beginning. So it's not just a blob of nothingness. It's actually a real piece of music that does something, and it's written for an enormous orchestra. It's all marked triple piano. The orchestra consists of 4 of everything woodwinds and brass. That's 4 flutes, 4 oboes, 4 clarinets, 4 bassoons, 4 trumpets, 4 trombones, 4 horns, 1 tuba, timpani, 2 pianos, 2 harps, 4 percussionists playing marimbas and vibraphones, and the regular strings. So it's a traditional large orchestra, and most of it is playing all the time. It's just changing density in slow waves. And like I said, it's all marked very quietly. It's a fascinating piece. And I think a real milestone in the history of music. It's a new thing, a genuine new thing in music. So let me play you now just about a minute and a half, the beginning and the end of Coptic Light, and you'll get a sense of what it sounds like. And if that's something that you think might be appealing or that you might want to try once in a while, give it a shot. Give it a shot. You could do far worse. I find it extremely calming and really fascinating to listen to and ear-catching. You play it at a low volume. Make sure the ambient in which you listen is quiet so you can hear what's going on, and you can either focus on it or you can just treat it as like white noise and fall asleep to it, which works fabulously well. I did do a video, by the way, on Feldman, so you can also look at that, which talks about basically what I just said. So maybe there's no point anymore. Anyway, these performances are with the ORF Vienna Radio Symphony Orchestra and the Arditi Quartet in Quartet and Orchestra, conducted by Michael Boder and Emilia Pomarico in the String Quartet and Orchestra. Here it is, Coptic Light. You get the picture. There's nothing more that needs to be explained. It just is what it is, and it defines itself and explains itself perfectly clearly as you listen. It doesn't require any story behind the music kind of thing, or any special knowledge or special information, or you don't have to be a musical theoretician to understand it. It just is. And I love music that just is. That's what music should be, I think, one way or another. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me. Enjoy your Morton Feldman, and take care.